Welcome to a story of redemption, family, and the power of second chances. Zach Mitchell is a hardened businessman, focused only on success, until the night he discovers two young brothers, Luke and Ben, alone on the streets. Taking them in, Zach quickly finds himself entangled in a web of danger and secrets, all tied to his own past and a former friend, Michael Prescott. As Zach fights to keep the boys safe from the shadowy threats closing in, he's forced to confront his mistakes and the demons he thought he left behind. With danger escalating and his enemies growing bolder, Zach must decide how far he's willing to go to protect the children who have become his family. Can he offer them a future that's different from his own troubled past? If you're ready for an emotional ride filled with suspense, hope, and transformation, hit subscribe and join us for this unforgettable journey. And don't forget to leave a comment with your thoughts. Your feedback means the world to us and helps us keep telling stories that matter. The city skyline glittered like a sea of distant stars, their lights reflecting off the glass walls of skyscrapers that stretched high into the night sky. Zachary Mitchell stood in his penthouse office, his gaze fixed on the urban sprawl below. To many, the view would have been mesmerizing, a testament to success. But tonight, it felt like an expanse of emptiness. At 53, Zach had built an empire of wealth and influence, shaping the city from behind the glass walls of Mitchell Holdings. His real estate firm owned half of the skyline, each building a monument to his ambition. Yet, as he watched the city pulse with life, the silence of his penthouse office was suffocating, wrapping around him like a shroud. The space around him was immaculate, with dark oak paneling, a sleek marble desk, and leather-bound books that hinted at a cultured life. But to Zach, it felt hollow, an echo of the life he had sacrificed for his success. He turned away from the window, his eyes settling on the corner of his desk where a silver frame lay face down. He hesitated, then reached out with a hand that trembled ever so slightly, turning the frame upright. Staring back at him was a younger version of himself, alongside a smiling man, Michael Prescott, his former business partner. They had built Mitchell Holdings together, dreaming of changing the city's skyline. But the picture held a bitterness that lingered, a reminder of how far they had fallen apart. "You'll regret this, Zach." Michael's words echoed in his mind from the day Zach had leveraged a hostile takeover to push him out of their shared company. It was a turning point, a decision that had elevated Zach's career but had cost him his closest friend. Zach set the photo back down, this time facing up, the weight of guilt pressing against his chest. He moved to the bar in the corner, pouring himself a whiskey, the amber liquid catching the dim light. He took a sip, savoring the burn that chased away his thoughts, if only for a moment. Just then, his phone buzzed against the marble desk, its vibrations shattering the quiet. Frowning, he walked over and glanced at the screen. It was a message from his security team about a disturbance near one of his properties downtown, something about a figure loitering around an empty building. Usually he would forward such issues to his staff, dismissing them as minor problems. But tonight something gnawed at him, a restlessness he couldn't explain. He shrugged on his tailored coat and made his way to the elevator, the cold metal doors closing behind him with a soft hiss, carrying him down to a night he could never have anticipated. The city was cold tonight, a chill wind sweeping through the streets. Zach's sleek black sedan cut through the quiet neighborhoods as he neared the location of the reported disturbance. The address brought him into a part of town he rarely visited, far from the polished high-rises and luxury condos of his world. Here the buildings were older, some with peeling paint, and the streetlights flickered as if struggling against the darkness. Zach slowed the car, scanning the shadows for any sign of trouble. His headlights swept across a crumbling facade when something made him hit the brakes sharply. A small figure huddled on the sidewalk under a dim, flickering streetlight. As he leaned closer, his breath caught. It was a child, no older than 7, clutching a bundle wrapped in a tattered blanket. Zach's hands tightened on the steering wheel, his mind scrambling for logic. This wasn't something he had expected to see. Not in the city, not here, and certainly not in front of his property. For a moment, he thought of calling the police, letting them handle it. But when the child's face turned towards the headlights, revealing wide, fearful eyes, something inside him shifted. After a moment's hesitation, he turned off the engine and stepped out of the car. The cold air hit him like a slap, biting through his coat as he approached. The child, thin and shivering, looked up at him with a mix of fear and hope that cut through the layers of detachment Zach had built over the years. "Hey," Zach said, his voice softer than he intended. "What are you doing out here? Where are your parents?" The boy flinched, tightening his grip on the bundle. Up close, Zach realized it wasn't just a blanket, it was a baby, a tiny infant cradled against the boy's chest, barely stirring in the frigid air. "My name is Zach," he tried again, crouching down to the boy's level, making an effort to seem less intimidating. "What's your name?" The child hesitated before whispering, "Luke." Zach nodded, offering a reassuring smile. "And who's this?" he asked, gesturing to the baby. The boy glanced down at the sleeping infant, then back at Zach, his voice trembling. "This is Ben. He's my little brother." Zach's mind raced, caught between the responsibility he felt and the voice of reason telling him to call the authorities. But when he saw the way Luke cradled Ben, protective despite his own fear, he felt a tug deep in his chest. It was a feeling he hadn't experienced in years, an instinct to protect. "It's not safe out here, Luke. Would you like to come with me? I can take you somewhere warm." Luke's eyes filled with a cautious hope, but there was suspicion too. "You won't take us away from each other?" The question hit Zach like a punch. What had these boys been through to make that their first concern? He knelt closer, his breath misting in the night air. "I promise I won't separate you." The promise hung heavy in the air, but after what felt like an eternity, Luke nodded. Zach helped him to his feet, noticing how light the boy was, how fragile. As they walked to the car, he shrugged off his coat and wrapped it around Luke and Ben, hoping it might offer some warmth. Once inside the heated car, Luke settled into the back seat, keeping Ben cradled against him. Zach caught their reflection in the rearview mirror. Two small figures seeking safety and a man who had never considered himself capable of giving it. The drive back to the mansion was silent, but inside, Zach's thoughts churned. He knew he should be calling child services, letting the professionals handle it. But as he glanced back at Luke's exhausted face, he knew he couldn't bring himself to do it. Not tonight. The mansion gates swung open, and Zach made a decision. He would give the boys a safe place for the night, and in the morning he would figure out what to do. Little did he know, this simple act of kindness was about to set in motion a chain of events that would change his life forever. Zach pulled up to his mansion, its towering facade illuminated by the security lights. As he parked, he glanced back at Luke, who had curled up in the back seat with Ben snug against his chest. The sight of them, two fragile figures huddled together, pulled at something inside him. He had never wanted children, never considered himself the type for a family. His life had always been about control, about crafting a legacy of glass and steel. But now, all of that seems as cold as the night air outside. Zach gently nudged Luke's shoulder. "We're here," he said, keeping his voice soft. Luke stirred, blinking blearily before tightening his hold on Ben, who remained asleep, oblivious to the world outside. Zach opened the back door and helped Luke out, carrying Ben in his arms. The baby's tiny face peeked out from the blanket, and Zach felt an unfamiliar warmth settle in his chest as Ben shifted, letting out a small sigh. The front door swung open as Mrs. Calloway, the housekeeper, appeared. Her hair, usually tightly pinned, was slightly tousled from a long evening. Her eyes widened at the sight of Zach carrying a baby, with a small, bedraggled boy trailing behind him. "Mr. Mitchell, what on earth?" she began, but Zach shook his head, gesturing for her to lower her voice. "I'll explain later, Mrs. Calloway. Right now, we need to get these boys inside and warm." Mrs. Calloway looked at him with concern, but she nodded, leading them into the grand foyer. The polished marble floors and high ceilings suddenly felt like they belonged to another world, one that had never seen anything as vulnerable as these children. Zach set Ben down on the plush sofa in the living room, carefully adjusting the blanket around him. Luke hovered close, his eyes darting around the unfamiliar space. Zach's mansion, with its gilded mirrors and chandeliers, was as foreign to him as a palace in a fairy tale. Mrs. Calloway returned with a steaming mug of hot cocoa, handing it to Luke. "Here you go, sweetheart. This will warm you up." Luke took the mug with both hands, his fingers trembling as they wrapped around the warmth. He glanced up at Zach, his expression wary. "Why are you helping us?" The question struck Zach harder than he expected. Why was he helping them? He could have handed them over to the authorities, washed his hands about the situation. But instead, he found himself saying, "Because you needed someone to help. And sometimes people need to do the right thing, even when it's hard." Luke studied him for a moment, then took a tentative sip of the cocoa. For the first time, Zach saw a glimmer of relief in the boy's eyes, and it stirred something deep inside him. Something that felt like hope. The night stretched on, with Mrs. Calloway helping Luke into a warm set of pajamas that hung loosely on his small frame, and settled Ben into a makeshift crib in one of the guest rooms. When she finally turned to Zach, her expression was a mix of curiosity and worry. "Mr. Mitchell, we need to notify the authorities about this," she said, her voice low so as not to disturb the sleeping children. "We can't keep them here without getting them some help." Zach sighed, running a hand through his hair. "I know, Calloway. But just for tonight, let's let them rest. We'll call first thing in the morning." Mrs. Calloway nodded, though she cast a worried glance down the hall where the guest room door stood ajar, revealing the outline of Luke curled up beside the crib. "They're lucky you found them," she said softly, before heading off to bed. The following morning, Zach awoke to the sound of a baby's cry, a sharp, piercing sound that cut through the stillness of the mansion. It took him a moment to orient himself, remembering the events of the previous night. He quickly pulled on a robe and made his way downstairs, where he found Luke in the kitchen, struggling to soothe Ben as Mrs. Calloway prepared breakfast. Zach paused in the doorway, watching the scene unfold. It was strange, domestic almost, a far cry from the silence that usually filled his mornings. He stepped forward, clearing his throat. "Morning, Ben." Luke looked up, his eyes red-rimmed from exhaustion, but he managed a small, uncertain smile. Ben quieted at the sound of Zach's voice, turning his head to look at him with wide, curious eyes. "You're pretty good with him," Zach said, offering Luke an awkward but genuine smile. "It's impressive." Luke's expression softened, his grip on Ben loosening slightly. "I've had to take care of him a lot," he said quietly. "It's just been us for a while." Zach felt a pang of sadness at those words, and he couldn't stop himself from reaching out to rest a hand on Luke's shoulder. The boy stiffened at the touch, but didn't pull away. "Well, you don't have to do it alone anymore," Zach said. "At least, not right now." Luke met his gaze, and in that moment, Zach felt an unspoken bond settle between them. Fragile, but real. The peace didn't last long. Later that morning, a knock at the door sent a jolt of anxiety through Zach's chest. He opened it to find two police officers standing on the doorstep, a woman with sharp blue eyes, and a tall, broad-shouldered man beside her, Detective Samantha Rhodes and Officer Dan Holloway. "Mr. Mitchell?" Detective Rhodes asked, flashing her badge. "We're here about a report of 2 missing children. We understand that you might have some information." Zach's heart lurched. He forced a calm smile and nodded, stepping aside to let them in. "Yes, I found them last night. I was planning to call you this morning, but they were exhausted. I thought they could use a night of peace." Detective Rhodes's gaze sharpened as she glanced down the hallway, where Luke peeked out from behind the doorframe, holding Ben protectively. "We appreciate your concern, Mr. Mitchell, but this is a delicate situation. We'll need to speak with the children and ensure they're safe." Zach felt a surge of protectiveness he hadn't expected. He glanced back at Luke, who clung to the doorframe, his face pale with fear. "They're scared," Zach said, lowering his voice. "Can we take this slowly? Give them a chance to settle in." Detective Rhodes studied him for a long moment before nodding. "All right. But they'll need to stay in your care only temporarily. We'll arrange for a social worker to meet with them and assess the situation." As the officers began their formal questioning, Zach found himself watching Luke's face, the fear that lingered in his eyes as he clung to Ben. and something inside Zach hardened with resolve. He wouldn't let these children be thrown into a system that might tear them apart. The first night with the police gone, Zach sat alone in his study, the house wrapped in silence. The questions from the detectives still echoed in his mind. Who were Luke and Ben really running from, and why had he felt such a desperate need to help them? He picked up the photo of Michael Prescott again, tracing the outline of his former friend's face. "What would you have done, Mike?" he muttered, but no answer came, just the weight of his own guilt and the knowledge that tomorrow he would need to make decisions that could change all of their lives. But this time, he wouldn't be making those choices for himself. He was doing it for two kids who had shown up on his doorstep, needing someone to keep them safe. And for the first time in years, Zach Mitchell felt like he might have a chance to be something more than just a name on a building, a chance to be someone who made a difference. The next morning, sunlight filtered through the tall windows of Zach's living room, casting long shadows across the marble floors. Luke sat on the edge of the couch, fidgeting with the sleeves of an oversized sweatshirt Mrs. Calloway had found him. Ben lay on a blanket beside him, babbling happily at the dust motes floating through the beams of light. Zach watched them from the doorway, feeling a strange tightness in his chest, something he couldn't quite name. He had stayed up most of the night thinking about the boys, about the way Luke had clung to Ben when the police officers arrived, the terror in his eyes when they mentioned taking them away. He knew he couldn't delay the inevitable. Detective Rhodes would be back, likely with a social worker in tow, and the boys would be placed into the foster system. It was the logical next step, but as he watched Luke lean over to tickle Ben's tiny feet, drawing a gurgling laugh from his little brother, Zach felt a deep unease settle in his gut. Could he really trust the system to keep them safe? A few hours later, the doorbell rang and Zach's stomach tightened. He opened the door to find Detective Rhodes standing there, as expected, but this time she was accompanied by a tall woman with a clipboard and a no-nonsense expression. Her hair was pulled back into a severe bun, and she gave Zach a thin-lipped smile as she adjusted her glasses. "Mr. Mitchell, this is Ms. Brooks from Child Services," Rhodes said, her tone polite but formal. "She'll be taking custody of the children today and assessing their needs." Zach felt a flash of panic. He forced a smile, keeping his voice steady. "Of course. Come in." As they stepped into the foyer, Zach led them towards the living room where Luke and Ben waited. The social worker's eyes swept over the space, taking in the ornate decorations, the plush furniture, and then settled on the boys. Luke stiffened when he saw her, inching closer to Ben, his small hands gripping the blanket. Ms. Brooks offered a tight smile. "Hello, Luke. I'm here to take you and your brother somewhere safe, where you'll be looked after." Luke's gaze darted between Zach and the woman, and Zach could see the fear building in his eyes. He crouched down beside the couch, putting himself at eye level with Luke. "It's okay, Luke. She's here to help." Luke shook his head, his voice barely more than a whisper. "No, we can't go. He'll find us." The desperation in his voice sent a shiver through Zach. He turned to Detective Rhodes, who stood silently behind Ms. Brooks, her expression thoughtful as she watched the scene unfold. Zach saw an opening, one last chance to buy time. "Detective," Zach said, his voice low and urgent. "Look, I understand the process, but these kids are terrified. Can't we take a little more time to find out what's really going on before rushing them into the system?" Ms. Brooks frowned, her professional patience clearly wearing thin. "Mr. Mitchell, I appreciate your concern, but the sooner these children are in a structured environment, the better." Detective Rhodes glanced from Zach to Luke, and something shifted in her expression, sympathy maybe, or curiosity. She held up a hand. "Ms. Brooks, perhaps Mr. Mitchell has a point. Why don't we give him a day or two to gain the boys' trust? It might make it easier for them to transition. We don't want to traumatize them any further." Ms. Brooks pursed her lips, clearly unhappy with the suggestion, but after a long moment, she relented with a sigh. "Fine, but I'll need regular updates, and we'll revisit this in 48 hours. Zach let out a breath he didn't realize he'd been holding. As Ms. Brooks left, shooting him a look that promised this was only a temporary reprieve, Rhodes lingered by the door, studying him closely. "You've got a big heart for someone with a reputation like yours, Mr. Mitchell," she said, one eyebrow arched. "But a soft heart isn't always a safe one." Zach managed a strained smile. "I'm just trying to do the right thing, Detective." Rhodes's expression softened slightly. "Well, let's hope you don't regret it." Later that evening, after Mrs. Calloway had gone home and the mansion had settled into an uneasy quiet, Zach sat in his studies, his mind spinning. He replayed Luke's words over and over. "He'll find us." Zach reached for his phone and dialed an old contact, a private investigator named Frank Walters, who had helped him with background checks for potential business partners over the years. "Frank, it's Zach Mitchell," he said when the man picked up. "I need a favor. I'm looking after 2 kids and I need to know everything about where they've been and who might be after them." Frank's voice was skeptical on the other end of the line. "Kids, huh? That's a new one for you, Zach. But sure, I'll dig around. Send me what you've got." As he ended the call, Zach stared at the silver-framed photo of Michael Prescott on his desk. It was strange he had put away that part of his life for so long. But now, with Luke and Ben here, it felt like the past was creeping back into the present, no matter how much he tried to ignore it. The next day, Zach's phone buzzed just after lunch with a message from Frank. "Need to talk. Got some info." Zach slipped away from where Luke and Ben were playing in the living room, ducking into his studies to take the call. "What did you find?" Zach asked, his heart hammering in his chest. Frank's voice was grim. "The kid's mother died in a car accident a few months back. Brutal crash. But that's not the whole story. There's a man named Nathan Cole sniffing around, some lowlife with ties to shady deals. I heard he's been asking questions about a woman who ran off with 2 kids. My guess is she was running from him." Zach's grip tightened on the phone. Why would she be running from him? Hard to say, but if this guy's involved, it's trouble. He's got a history of debt collection, intimidation. He's not above using violence to get what he wants. A cold dread settled in Zach's stomach. He glanced back towards the living room, where Luke was trying to make Ben laugh with a stuffed bear. "Do you think he's after the boys?" Frank paused, then sighed. "If they're connected to whatever mess their mother got into, it's a good bet." "You'd better watch your back, Zach." Zach ended the call and leaned back in his chair, trying to process the weight of Frank's words. He had thought he was just helping 2 kids who needed a roof over their heads, but now, he realized, he had walked into something far more dangerous. That evening, as the sun dipped below the horizon and shadows stretched long across the mansion, Zach joined Luke on the front steps. Ben had finally drifted off to sleep after hours of fussing, and Mrs. Calloway had retired for the night. The air was crisp, carrying the distant hum of city traffic. Zach handed Luke a cup of warm milk, watching as the boy wrapped his small hands around it. For a moment, they sat in companionable silence, broken only by the occasional chirp of crickets. Finally, Zach spoke. "Luke, when you said you were scared someone would find you, who did you mean?" Luke's shoulders tensed, and he stared into his cup, avoiding Zach's gaze. "It's just, there's this man. He hurt my mom. She took us away to keep us safe. But then she didn't come back." Zach felt a pang of sorrow twist inside him. "You don't have to be afraid anymore," he said, trying to keep his voice steady. "I promise, I won't let anyone hurt you or Ben." Luke looked up at him, and for the first time, Zach saw the hint of a tear in his eyes. People always promise that, but they never keep their promises. The words hit Zach like a punch to the gut, and he realized that he wasn't just fighting to protect these boys. He was fighting to earn Luke's trust, something that had been shattered long before they ever met. "I'll keep mine," Zach said quietly, meeting Luke's gaze. "You'll see." Luke held his gaze for a long moment, then nodded, his expression softening. And for the first time, Zach thought he saw a glimmer of hope in those young, tired eyes. The city skyline shimmered in the distance, but the view from Zach's penthouse no longer held the allure it once did. Instead, he found himself glancing down the hallway, where the warm glow of a nightlight peeked out from under the guest room door. Inside, Luke slept fitfully, tossing and turning, while Ben snored softly in the makeshift crib that Zach had set up beside the bed. It had been 2 days since Detective Rhodes and the social worker's first visit, and they would be back soon. Zach could feel the pressure mounting. He knew their patience would run out. He needed answers, a way to understand the full scope of the threat hanging over these boys. The doorbell rang, echoing through the mansion, and Zach's heart leapt into his throat. He took a deep breath, steeling himself before crossing the marble foyer to open the door. Detective Rhodes stood on the threshold, her sharp blue eyes scanning his face. This time, she was alone. "Detective," Zach said, trying to keep his voice steady. "Back for another visit?" She stepped inside, glancing around the entryway. "Ms. Brooks couldn't make it today. I wanted to come by and check on things myself." "How are the boys holding up?" Zach closed the door behind her, keeping his voice low. "They're scared. I think Luke's finally starting to trust me, but he's still terrified that someone will take Ben away. And I found out a bit more about why." He paused, catching the flicker of interest in her eyes. "There's a man named Nathan Cole. He's got a history, and it sounds like he's the reason their mother was running." Rhodes's expression hardened. "Cole's trouble. He's been on our radar a few times, but we've never been able to pin anything on him. If he's involved, the situation is a lot more dangerous than we thought." She crossed her arms, studying Zach with an intensity that made him feel exposed. "Why are you doing this, Mr. Mitchell? Most people in your position would hand the kids over and let the system handle it. But you're sticking your neck out. Why?" Zach hesitated, the question cutting deeper than he expected. "Maybe because I've spent too long making decisions that were only about myself," he said finally. "This time, I want to do something that actually matters." Rhodes nodded slowly, a hint of respect in her gaze. "Just be careful. Cole's not the kind of man who lets things go. If he knows the kids are here, he'll come looking." Her words lingered in the air, and Zach realized that what she wasn't saying carried just as much weight as what she had. He watched as she left, her figure disappearing down the driveway, and a knot of determination settled in his chest. If Nathan Cole came looking, Zach would be ready. Next morning, Zach awoke to the sound of Luke's voice, barely more than a whisper. He rolled out of bed and padded down the hallway to find Luke sitting in the crib, talking softly to Ben as he played with a toy truck. Zach leaned against the doorframe, listening to the boy's gentle words. "It's okay, Ben. We're safe here. Mr. Zach said he'd help us." Maybe he will." Something tightened in Zach's chest. He cleared his throat, making his presence known, and Luke turned, his face flushing with embarrassment. "Sorry," Luke mumbled, ducking his head. "I didn't mean to wake you." Zach shook his head, offering a small smile. "You didn't. Actually, I was thinking we could get out of the house today." "Would you like that?" Luke's eyes lit up with a flicker of excitement. "Can we go to the park? Ben likes to watch the ducks." Zach hesitated for a moment, knowing the risks of taking them out into the open, but then he saw the hope in Luke's expression, the yearning for a sliver of normalcy, and he found himself nodding. "Kid, let's go see some ducks." The park was a quiet oasis, tucked away from the hustle of the city. As they strolled along the path that wound around a small pond, Zach watched Ben's face light up at the sight of ducks paddling across the water. Luke held his brother's hand tightly, his other clutching a bag of breadcrumbs that Mrs. Calloway had packed for them. Zach stood back, letting the boys enjoy the moment. He tried to focus on the peaceful scene, but his mind kept drifting back to the looming threats. He scanned the park's entrance, alert for any sign of Nathan Cole or someone who might be watching. "Relax, Zach," he muttered to himself, trying to shake off the tension. "It's just a park." But as they headed back towards the car, he couldn't shake the feeling that something was wrong. The air felt charged, like the moment before a thunderstorm. He hurried the boys along, glancing over his shoulder more than once, but there was no one there. Just his own shadow stretching out behind them. Back at the mansion, Zach couldn't shake the unease that had followed him from the park. He checked every lock on the doors, double-checked the security system, but no matter what he did, the sense of being watched lingered like a shadow over his thoughts. That night, after Luke and Ben had gone to bed, Zach sat in his studies, his mind restless. He pulled up the security footage from the mansion's cameras, scanning through the recordings, but found nothing unusual. Just as he was about to shut down the monitor, a notification popped up. An alert from one of the outdoor cameras near the front gate. Zach froze, leaning closer. The timestamp showed that someone had been outside the gate just before sunset. A man, tall and broad-shouldered, lingering near the edge of the camera's range. Zach's blood ran cold as he clicked to enhance the image. It wasn't clear, but he could make out a figure wearing a dark jacket. The collar turned up against the wind. The angle obscured his face, but something about the man's stance, the way he seemed to be studying the mansion, made Zach's pulse quicken. He called Frank, his voice barely controlled. "I need you to run the plates of any vehicles that have been near my property in the last 24 hours. There was someone outside the gate today." Frank's voice was grim. "Got it. I'll get back to you as soon as I can. And Zach, keep those kids close." The next day brought new challenges. Detective Rhodes returned, this time with Ms. Brooks in tow. The social worker's demeanor was curt, her frustration evident as she addressed Zach in the foyer. "I've given you time, Mr. Mitchell," she said, her tone clipped, "but these children need to be placed in a proper home environment. I appreciate that you want to help, but this arrangement isn't sustainable." Zach struggled to keep his composure, knowing that any misstep could mean losing Luke and Ben. "Just give me a little longer. I'm working with Detective Rhodes on this, and there's a man who could be a threat to the kids. We need to make sure they're safe before uprooting them again." Ms. Brooks folded her arms, clearly unimpressed. "You're not a legal guardian, Mr. Mitchell. You don't have the authority to make those kinds of decisions." Luke appeared at the top of the staircase, clutching the banister as he listened in. Zach saw the fear in the boy's eyes, and his resolve hardened. He turned to Rhodes, silently pleading for her support. Rhodes hesitated, then addressed Ms. Brooks. "With all due respect, the situation is more complicated than a standard custody issue. I think it's in the best interest of the children to remain here until we can fully assess the danger." Ms. Brooks's expression was steely, but she finally relented with a sigh. "Fine, but this is your last extension, Mr. Mitchell. If we don't have a resolution soon, I will be forced to take action." Zach exhaled slowly as Ms. Brooks left, but the relief was short-lived. Rhodes lingered, her expression troubled. "You're running out of time, Zach. If there's more to this than you're telling me, now's the time to come clean." Zach glanced up the stairs at Luke, who had retreated back to his room. He met Rhodes's gaze, his voice rough with emotion. "All I know is that those kids need someone to fight for them, and I'm not backing down." That night, just as Zach was beginning to feel the weight of exhaustion settle in, Frank called back. "I ran those plates, Zach. The vehicle's registered to Nathan Cole. He's definitely been snooping around your place." Zach's grip tightened on the phone. "How close is he?" "Close enough to be dangerous. You need to move fast, Zach. If he's after those kids, it's only a matter of time before he makes his move." Zach's mind raced, adrenaline spiking through his veins. He hung up and rushed to the guest room, where Luke was sitting up in bed, clutching his blanket tightly. "Luke," Zach said urgently, kneeling by the bed, "I need you to tell me everything you remember about the man who's after you. Do you know why he's looking for you and Ben?" Luke's face went pale, his hands trembling as he gripped the edge of the blanket. "Mom said he wanted money, but she didn't have any. She said he wouldn't stop until he got what he wanted." Zach's heart pounded in his chest. He didn't have time to comfort the boy now. He needed to act. "I'm going to make some calls, Luke. I promise I'll keep you both safe." Luke looked up at him with wide, fearful eyes, and for the first time, Zach felt the full weight of his responsibility. Not just to protect, but to keep the promise he had made. Zach barely slept that night, the weight of his decisions pressing down on him like a heavy blanket. He sat in the dimly lit study, staring at the flickering security footage on his laptop. The image of the shadowy figure, Nathan Cole, lingered in his mind, an unspoken threat lurking just outside the safety of the mansion walls. He glanced towards the guest room down the hall, where Luke and Ben slept. For a moment, he imagined what might have happened if he had left them out on that cold street, or if he had handed them over to the social worker on the first day. But that thought tightened his chest, and he shook it away, returning to the reality of the situation. Cole wouldn't stop, not until he got what he wanted, and Zach knew he couldn't afford to be unprepared. He reached for his phone and sent a text to Detective Rhodes. "We need to talk. Urgent." The following morning, as Zach waited for Rhodes's response, He joined Luke and Ben at breakfast. The kitchen was filled with the warm smells of pancakes and syrup, courtesy of Mrs. Calloway, who had arrived early with groceries and a concerned expression. Luke sat quietly, cutting his pancakes into tiny squares while Ben reached clumsily for a piece, smearing syrup across his cheeks. Zach found himself smiling at the sight, a brief reprieve from the constant tension that had settled on his shoulders. "Thanks, Mrs. Calloway," Zach said as she poured him a fresh cup of coffee. He hesitated, then lowered his voice. "I might need your help with the boys again tonight. There's a situation I'm dealing with." She looked at him sharply, concern etched into the lines around her eyes. "Whatever you've gotten yourself into, Mr. Mitchell, just make sure those boys come out of it safe." Zach nodded, grateful for her loyalty, even if he couldn't explain the full extent of what was happening. As she returned to tidying up the kitchen, his phone buzzed on the counter. A message from Rhodes, "Meet me at the station." Noon. Zach's stomach clenched. He turned to Luke, who looked up from his plate with a questioning gaze. "Hey buddy, I need to go out for a little while. Mrs. Calloway will stay here with you and Ben. I'll be back soon, okay?" Luke's face pinched with worry, and Zach reached out to ruffle his hair gently. "It's going to be fine. I just need to take care of some things." Luke nodded, but the fear in his eyes made Zach's chest tighten. He grabbed his coat and left, forcing himself not to look back. He had to trust that Mrs. Calloway would keep the boys safe while he took the next steps. The police station buzzed with activity when Zach arrived, the fluorescent lights casting harsh reflections on the linoleum floors. Detective Rhodes met him in the lobby, her expression tense as she led him back to a small conference room. Inside, she closed the door, folding her arms across her chest. "All right, Zach, tell me what you've got," she said, her voice low but urgent. Zach pulled out his phone, showing her the blurry image from the security footage. "That's Cole, outside my gate yesterday. He's been watching the house. I'm worried he's planning something." Rhodes swore under her breath, pacing the length of the small room. "That matches the intel we've been gathering. Cole's been asking around about you, but we didn't realize he was getting this bold." She turned to face him, her expression serious. "We need to move the kids. It's not safe to keep them at your mansion. I can arrange a secure location, but you'll need to cooperate with child services." Zach shook his head, frustration boiling inside him. "No, I'm not letting them disappear into the system. Cole's dangerous, but I have the resources to protect them. If you give me a little more time." "You don't understand what you're up against, Zach," Rhodes snapped, then softened when she saw the desperation in his face. "Look, I know you care about those kids, but this isn't a game. If you try to handle this on your own, you're putting all of you in more danger." Zach's jaw tightened, the reality of her words sinking in. He ran a hand through his hair, pacing the small space. "I can't lose them, Rhodes, not like this. There's got to be another way." She studied him, and something in her expression shifted. "All right, I'll give you one more day. But if Cole makes another move, I'm stepping in, no matter what you think you can handle." "Understood." Zach nodded, grateful despite the tension crackling between them. "Thank you, Samantha." Her eyes softened at the use of her first name, but she quickly hid it behind her professional mask. "One day, Zach, don't make me regret it." That night, the mansion felt like a fortress. Every window and door locked, the security system set to its highest level. Zach double-checked the motion detectors he'd installed around the perimeter, his nerves wound tight. He knew he couldn't sleep, not when Cole might be out there, planning his next move. In the guest room, Luke lay awake, staring up at the ceiling as the shadows shifted across the walls. Zach slipped into the room, pulling a chair up beside the bed. "Couldn't sleep, huh?" he asked, keeping his voice gentle. Luke shook his head, glancing towards the crib where Ben was dozing. "What if he finds us, Mr. Zach? What if he tries to take Ben away?" Zach's chest ached at the raw fear in the boy's voice. He leaned forward, resting a hand on Luke's shoulder. "I promise you, I'm not going to let that happen. I've got security on the house, and Detective Rhodes is helping us. We're going to keep you both safe." Luke was silent for a long moment. Then he finally whispered, "I believe you." The simple words hit Zach like a punch. He reached out and ruffled Luke's hair, trying to keep his voice steady. "Get some rest, kiddo. Tomorrow's going to be a better day, okay? Luke nodded, his eyes slipping closed, and Zach stayed beside him until he was sure the boy was asleep. But as he left the room, he couldn't shake the sense that something was about to change. That the fragile peace they had built was teetering on the edge of a knife. The next morning, just as the sun was rising over the city, a noise jolted Zach awake. A loud crash from the front of the house. He bolted out of bed, grabbing the baseball bat he kept by the door. Heart pounding, he rushed down the hallway, only to find the front door swinging open, the lock splintered. He barely had time to process what was happening before a shadowy figure lunged at him, shoving him back against the wall. The bat fell from his grip as he struggled, managing to catch a glimpse of the intruder's face. "Nathan Cole, should have minded your own business, Mitchell." Cole growled, his breath hot against Zach's face. He twisted Zach's arm behind his back, forcing him to his knees. "Where are the kids?" Zach gritted his teeth against the pain, panic clawing at his chest. He had to buy time, anything to keep Cole away from Luke and Ben. "They're gone. Took them somewhere safe. You won't find them." Cole's grip tightened, and he slammed Zach's head against the wall, leaving him dazed and gasping. "Don't play games with me, Mitchell. I know they're here." Through the haze of pain, Zach's mind raced. He knew he had minutes, maybe less, before Cole made his way to the guest room. Summoning his strength, he managed to twist out of Cole's grip, sending them both crashing into a side table. The noise echoed through the mansion, and suddenly, Detective Rhodes's voice rang out from the doorway. "Freeze! Police!" Cole spun towards her, reaching for a weapon inside his jacket, but Rhodes was faster. She tackled him to the ground, wrenching his arm behind his back as she cuffed him. Her eyes flashed with anger as she hauled him to his feet. "You're under arrest, Cole. You want to make a move now?" Cole sneered at her, but kept silent as she marched him towards the door, calling for backup over her radio. Zach leaned against the wall, breathing hard, his vision swimming. He barely registered Rhodes's voice as she turned back to him, her expression shifting from anger to concern. "Are you okay, Zach?" He nodded, forcing himself upright, his mind already on Luke and Ben. "Just check on the boys." Rhodes moved quickly down the hall, and Zach followed, his heart hammering in his chest. They found Luke standing in the doorway of the guest room, clutching a crying Ben, his face pale with terror. Zach crossed the room in 2 strides, wrapping his arms around both boys. Luke buried his face in Zach's shoulder, his small body trembling. "I was so scared, Mr. Zach. I thought he'd take us." Zach's arms tightened around him, a wave of relief and protectiveness washing over him. "He's not going to hurt you, Luke. He's never going to hurt you again." I promise. Zach's knuckles were still raw and bruised from his struggle with Nathan Cole. He stood in the hallway outside the guest room, his back pressed against the cold wall, struggling to catch his breath. The mansion, usually a fortress of silence, now echoed with the muffled sounds of police radios and hurried footsteps as backup officers secured the premises. Inside the room, Detective Rhodes knelt beside Luke, gently coaxing him out of his shock while Ben clung to his older brother's shirt, tears streaking his chubby cheeks. Zach could only watch, feeling an ache deep in his chest, an ache that told him he had come too close to losing them. Rhodes rose to her feet, meeting Zach's gaze across the room. "You need to get looked at," she said, her voice firm but softening as she took in his disheveled appearance. "You've got a nasty cut on your head." Zach shook his head. "I'm fine. Just tell me he's going away for good." Rhodes's expression was grim as she glanced toward the officers escorting Nathan Cole out the front door, his hands cuffed behind his back. "He'll be in custody for now, but he'll make bail. You know how this goes. We'll keep an eye on him. But if he has connections, he could try something again." Zach's frustration bubbled over. "So what? We wait until he makes another move, until he finds a way to slip through the cracks?" His voice rose, and he had to force himself to calm down when he saw Luke flinch at the sound. Rhodes touched his arm, grounding him. "We'll get him, Zach. But for now, we need to focus on keeping the kids safe. That means we need the full picture, everything about why Cole wanted them." Zach swallowed hard, his mind racing back to his conversation with Luke, to the name that had nearly slipped from his lips. "There's something I need to tell you, but not here. Let's go to the study." She nodded, casting a glance back at Luke and Ben. "I'll be right back, Luke. You're safe here, okay?" Luke nodded, still clutching Ben tightly, and Rhodes followed Zach out of the room. As they walked down the hallway, Zach's mind churned with memories he had tried to bury. Memories of a younger man with ambition and ideals. A man who had once been his best friend. In the study, Rhodes sat across from Zach, leaning forward with a notepad in hand, her expression intense. "What is it, Zach? You've been holding back something since the beginning. It's time to come clean." Zach ran a hand through his hair, wincing as he touched the cut on his scalp. He forced himself to meet her gaze, taking a deep breath before speaking. "The kids, Luke and Ben. I think they might be the children of Michael Prescott." Rhodes blinked, her pen pausing over the notepad. "Michael Prescott, as in your former business partner? The one you pushed out of your company years ago?" Zach nodded, the words coming out in a rush now that the dam had broken. "We started Mitchell Holdings together. He was the idealist, the one who believed in building a better city. But things got tough and I saw a way to get him out, to take the company for myself. We had a falling out. He left, and I haven't heard from him since." Rhodes's eyes narrowed, connecting the dots. "And you think Luke and Ben are his kids? Why didn't you say something earlier?" "Because I wasn't sure," Zach admitted, guilt flooding him. "It wasn't until Luke mentioned their last name, Prescott, that it clicked. I thought it might be a coincidence, but now I can't shake the feeling that this is all connected. And if Cole was after them, maybe it's because of something that happened to Michael." Rhodes was silent for a moment, processing the revelation. "We never found any record of Michael Prescott having kids, but if he was keeping a low profile after your fallout, it makes sense. And if their mother died recently, it means they've been on the run ever since. But why would Cole target Michael's kids?" Zach's jaw tightened, the old bitterness resurfacing. Michael was in debt when he left the company. He had made some bad investments. If he turned to the wrong people for help, maybe they came after him when he couldn't pay them back, and now they're using his kids to settle the score. Rhodes nodded slowly, the gears turning in her mind. "We need to dig into Michael's financials, see if we can trace any of his debts back to Cole's network. If we can find out what they were after, it might give us leverage." Zach rubbed his temples, feeling the weight of the past pressing down on him. "I'll help however I can. But whatever we find, I'm not giving up those boys. Not when they've already been through so much." Rhodes studied him for a long moment, her expression softening. "I know, Zach, and I'll do everything I can to make sure they stay with you, but you need to be ready for what we might find. This could open old wounds." Zach let out a bitter laugh. "They've been open for a long time, Rhodes. I just didn't realize how deep they ran." That evening, after Rhodes left with a promise to call with any updates, Zach returned to the guest room where Luke and Ben waited. Luke sat by the window, looking out at the distant city lights, while Ben lay asleep in his lap. Zach hesitated in the doorway, then walked over and crouched down beside them. "Hey, buddy," he said softly. "I know today was scary, but Detective Rhodes and I are going to make sure nothing like that happens again." Luke's eyes, wide and vulnerable, turned toward him. "Is he really gone?" Zach nodded. "For now, yes. But Luke, there's something I need to ask you, and I need you to be honest with me." Luke tensed, his small hands gripping Ben's shirt. Zach took a deep breath, bracing himself. "Luke, your last name, it's Prescott, isn't it? Your father, was his name Michael?" The question seemed to hang in the air, and for a moment, Zach feared he had pushed too far. But then Luke's face crumpled, and tears welled up in his eyes. He whispered, his voice cracking, "My dad's name was Michael. He used to tell us stories before everything got bad. But he's gone now. Mom said we had to run. She said we couldn't trust anyone." Zach felt the ground shift beneath him, his suspicions confirmed. He reached out, resting a hand on Luke's shoulder. "I knew your dad, Luke. A long time ago we worked together. He was a good man." Luke sniffled, wiping his eyes with the back of his hand. "Then why did he leave? Why didn't he come back for us?" Zach's throat tightened. He struggled to find the right words, the words that would make sense to a 7-year-old who had lost so much. Sometimes people make mistakes, big ones, and they think the best way to fix things is to walk away. But that doesn't mean he didn't love you. Luke's lip trembled, and he looked up at Zach with a mixture of hope and hurt. Do you think he'd be mad if he knew we were with you? Zach's heart twisted at the question. No, Luke. I think he'd be glad that you're safe. And I promise you, I'm going to do everything I can to keep you that way. For a long moment, they sat there in silence, the weight of unspoken truths pressing between them. Then Luke leaned forward, wrapping his thin arms around Zach's neck in a hesitant hug. Zach froze, surprised by the gesture, but then he wrapped his arms around the boy, holding him close. He closed his eyes, feeling the sting of tears welling up, and he made a silent promise to Michael, wherever he might be. I'm going to do right by your kids, Mike. I'm not going to let them down. Later that night, after Luke had finally drifted off to sleep beside Ben, Zach stood alone in his studies, staring at the framed photo of himself and Michael on the desk. He felt the weight of his past decisions pressing down on him, decisions that had pushed his friend away, that had left a scar that time had never healed. He picked up the photo, tracing the edges of the silver frame with his thumb. I'm sorry, Mike, he murmured to the empty room. I should have been there for you. I should have done more. A quiet knock on the door interrupted his thoughts, and he turned to find Mrs. Calloway standing there, a concerned look in her eyes. You all right, Mr. Mitchell? Zach managed a tired smile. Just thinking. She nodded, stepping inside and glancing at the photo in his hands. Those boys? They need you, sir. And I think you need them, too. Zach swallowed, setting the photo back on the desk. Yeah. I think you're right. As Mrs. Calloway left, Zach sat down at his desk, a new determination settling in his chest. He would do whatever it took to protect Luke and Ben, to keep them out of the hands of those who would use them. And maybe, just maybe, he could find a way to make up for the mistakes of the past. The following morning dawned gray and overcast, casting a muted light through the mansion's tall windows. Zach stood by the front door, watching as Luke and Ben finished their breakfast under Mrs. Calloway's watchful eye. After the chaos of the previous night, the quiet felt strange, like calm before a storm. Zach's phone buzzed in his pocket, and he saw a message from Detective Rhodes. Meet me at the old Riverside Cafe. We need to talk. Zach's stomach twisted. He wasn't sure what Rhodes had found, but he knew it couldn't be good. He turned to Mrs. Calloway, who raised an eyebrow at the look on his face. I have to step out again, but I'll be back as soon as I can, he told her. Keep an eye on the boys. Mrs. Calloway nodded, her expression somber. Just make sure you come back in one piece, Mr. Mitchell. Those kids are counting on you. Zach squeezed her shoulder, appreciating the reassurance more than he could say. As he left the house, he glanced back once, catching a glimpse of Luke's small face pressed against the window, watching him go. The Riverside Cafe was an old, weathered building on the outskirts of town, with chipped paint and a faded neon sign that buzzed intermittently. It was the kind of place where people came to be forgotten, where conversations faded into the background noise of clinking dishes and murmured voices. Zach spotted Rhodes at a corner booth, her back to the wall and her eyes scanning the room. He slid into the seat across from her, and she wasted no time, sliding a manila folder across the table. You were right about the debts, she said, her voice low. I pulled Michael Prescott's old financial records. He borrowed a lot of money from a private lender, a front for Cole's operation. Zach flipped open the folder, his eyes scanning the pages of financial transactions and loan documents. The numbers were staggering. This is why Cole's after them. He thinks they're the key to getting his money back. Rhodes nodded grimly. Or maybe more. The last record of Prescott's whereabouts showed him in contact with people tied to offshore accounts. He might have hidden whatever assets he had left before he disappeared. If Cole thinks those kids know where the money is, Zach's stomach churned. He glanced at the black and white photos of Michael taken years ago when they were still business partners. Michael wouldn't have left his kids unprotected. If he hid something, it was to keep them safe. Rhodes studied him, her expression unreadable. I know you're trying to protect those boys, Zach, but if we don't find out what Cole's after, we'll be blind to the next move. I've got contacts in federal law enforcement, people who can help, but we need something concrete to give them. Zach's jaw clenched. He knew she was right. but involving more authorities meant risking losing Luke and Ben to the system. It meant taking a leap of faith, something he wasn't used to doing. But as he thought of Luke's frightened face, of the way Ben clung to his brother's shirt, he realized he was willing to take that risk. "All right," he said finally, closing the folder. "I'll work with you, but on one condition. We keep the kids out of this as much as possible. They've been through enough." Rhodes nodded, reaching for her coffee. "Agreed. But you need to be prepared for whatever comes next. People like Cole don't give up easily." Zach leaned back in the booth, feeling the weight of the decision settled on his shoulders. "I'm starting to figure that out." That afternoon, back at the mansion, Zach found Luke playing with Ben in the living room, building a tower out of colorful plastic blocks. For a moment he watched them from the doorway, trying to hold on to the peaceful image before the storm that was surely coming. "Hey, Luke," he said, stepping into the room. "Can we talk for a minute?" Luke looked up, his expression curious but guarded. He nodded, setting down the blocks, and Zach led him into the study where they could have some privacy. Zach took a deep breath, kneeling down to Luke's level. "I know this is a lot for you, buddy. I just want you to know that you're safe here, and I'm going to do everything I can to keep you and Ben together. But I need you to tell me if there's anything at all, your dad told you before he left." Luke's brow furrowed as he thought. "Dad used to talk about his work a lot," he said slowly, his voice barely more than a whisper. "He said he was trying to make things right. And sometimes he'd look at this box he kept in his study. He said it was for us, but he never told me what was inside." Zach's heart pounded. "A box? Did he ever say where it was?" Luke shook his head, looking down at his hands. "Number. But he said it was somewhere safe where bad people couldn't find it." Zach forced a smile, resting a hand on the boy's shoulder. "Thank you, Luke. That's really helpful." But inside, Zach's mind raced. If there was a hidden stash or evidence of Prescott's dealings, it could be the key to turning the tide against Cole. And now, it was up to him and Rhodes to find it, before it was too late. That evening, Rhodes came by the mansion again, her car parked discreetly in the shadows of the driveway. She carried a laptop and a small scanner, tools for digging through whatever digital traces they could find. Zach led her into the study, where they set up their makeshift command center on his polished oak desk. He pulled out the old records he had kept from Mitchell Holdings, ledgers that he and Michael had worked on before they fell out. Rhodes sifted through bank statements and digital archives, her fingers moving swiftly across the keyboard. "Anything in these old records that might hint at where Prescott could have hidden the box?" Rhodes asked, glancing at Zach. He frowned, rifling through a stack of papers. He always talked about keeping a backup plan, a last resort. If he left something behind for Luke and Ben, it might be in a place he thought I'd never look. Rhodes studied his expression. "A place tied to the two of you, then. Somewhere with meaning." Zach's mind flashed back to the old Mitchell Prescott building downtown, the first office they had leased when they started their company. It had been abandoned for years now, replaced by a more modern headquarters, but Michael had always insisted on keeping the deed. "There's an old storage room in the basement of the first office building we leased," Zach said slowly. "It's been locked up for years, but Michael never wanted to sell it. He said it was our legacy. I bet he stashed something there." Rhodes nodded, her eyes bright with determination. "Then that's where we'll look. But we need to be careful. If Cole's still got people watching, he might be onto us." Zach met her gaze, the resolve hardening in his chest. "Let him come. I'm done hiding." That night, they left the boys with Mrs. Calloway, who had grown increasingly worried about Zach's late-night excursions, but had become a steadfast ally. Luke and Ben clung to him as he prepared to leave, and Zach had to steel himself against the guilt that twisted in his gut. "Where are you going, Mr. Zach?" Luke asked, his voice small. "You're not leaving us, are you?" Zach knelt down, pulling both boys into a hug. "I'm not leaving you, Luke. I'm just going to look for something that might help keep you safe. I'll be back before you know it." Luke nodded, though the fear lingered in his eyes. Zach ruffled his hair gently, then stood up and followed Rhodes out into the night. The old Mitchell Prescott building loomed like a ghost in the downtown district, its windows dark and boarded up. The wind howled through the empty streets as Zach and Rhodes approached the building's side entrance, the air thick with anticipation. Zach fumbled with the keys, finally managing to unlock the rusted door. The basement stairs creaked under their weight as they descended into the darkness, their flashlights casting eerie shadows along the walls. The storage room was just as Zach remembered it, cluttered with old filing cabinets, broken desks, and dusty crates. He moved to the far corner, where a large metal safe was half buried beneath a tarp. Rhodes scanned the room, her hand on her holstered weapon. "Keep an eye out, we don't know if Cole's men have followed us," Zach nodded, focusing on the safe. He twisted the dial, trying to recall the old combination that he and Michael had once joked about, dates that marked the company's early milestones. To his relief, the lock clicked open. Inside, he found a wooden box, intricately carved, with a brass latch. Zach's breath caught as he lifted it out, feeling the weight of Michael's trust in his hands. He opened the lid, revealing a stack of documents, a USB drive, and a faded photo of Michael with younger Luke and Ben. Rhodes leaned in, her eyes widened as she scanned the contents. These could be what we need: bank records, account numbers, maybe even proof of where Prescott hid the rest of the money. But before they could take a closer look, a noise echoed down the hallway. A heavy footstep that made the hair on the back of Zach's neck stand up. Rhodes's hand tightened on her gun. "We're not alone. Get the box and get ready to move." Zach shoved the documents into his coat pocket, clutching the wooden box tightly. His mind raced as they crept toward the stairs, his heart pounding in his chest. The sound of footsteps grew closer, the darkness pressing in around them. They reached the exit, but just as they pushed through the door, a figure stepped into the alleyway of a burly man with a scar running down the side of his face, his hand reaching inside his jacket. Rhodes reacted first, her voice sharp. "Freeze! Police!" The man ignored her, pulling out a gun, and Zach's body tensed, knowing they were out of time. He turned and bolted down the alley, Rhodes covering his retreat with a series of precise shots that ricocheted off the metal dumpsters. The sound of gunfire echoed through the night, mingling with the pounding of his footsteps, and Zach's mind flashed with images of Luke and Ben waiting back at the mansion. He couldn't let them down. He couldn't fail them now. The air was cold and biting as Zach and Rhodes dashed through the dark alleyways, their breaths coming in ragged bursts. The man who had confronted them in the alley was close behind, and Zach could hear his heavy footsteps echoing off the walls, growing closer with every step. Rhodes took the lead, her gun drawn, glancing back at Zach as they neared the end of the alleyway. "We need to get out of here. Now, my car's just around the corner." Zach nodded, clutching the wooden box tightly under his arm. His mind raced with thoughts of the documents inside, the clues they contained about Michael's hidden assets, the secrets that could finally expose Cole's operation. But none of it would matter if they didn't make it out alive. They rounded the corner, but before they could reach Rhodes's car, another figure appeared in front of them, a man with a shaved head and a sneer twisting his lips. He raised a pistol, leveling it at Zach's chest. "Hand over the box," he demanded, his voice flat and merciless. "Cole wants it, and he wants you gone, Mitchell." Zach's grip tightened on the box, and he took a step back, feeling the weight of the decision pressing on him. He couldn't let them take it. Not when it was their only chance to protect Luke and Ben. Rhodes stepped forward, her own gun trained on the man's head. "You take one more step, and I'll put you down," she warned, her voice cold and steady. "Walk away now, or you won't walk away at all." The man hesitated, glancing back over his shoulder at his partner, who had caught up and was now blocking their escape route. The tension crackled in the air, and Zach could see the calculation in the man's eyes, the weighing of odds and risks. But before he could decide, a distant siren cut through the night air, growing louder. The man swore under his breath, signaling to his partner. "This isn't over, Mitchell, you hear me?" They backed away, disappearing into the shadows as the siren grew closer. Rhodes kept her gun trained on them until they were gone, then turned back to Zach, her chest heaving with exertion. "We need to get back to the mansion now," she said, holstering her gun. "If they're this desperate, they might make a move on the kids." Zach's blood ran cold at the thought. He nodded, following her to the car, and they sped through the darkened streets, racing against time. Back at the mansion, Mrs. Calloway was waiting anxiously by the front door, her face pale with worry. As Zach and Rhodes hurried inside, she rushed to meet them. "Thank God you're back," she said, her voice trembling. "There were men outside earlier, watching the house." "I was afraid." Zach's heart clenched. "Where are the boys?" "They're upstairs, in the panic room," she replied, her hands twisting nervously. "I didn't know what else to do." Zach nodded, relief flooding through him. "You did the right thing, Mrs. Calloway. Stay here with Rhodes. I'm going to get them." He sprinted up the stairs, taking them two at a time, and reached the panic room, a reinforced space he'd had installed for emergencies. Just as Luke peeked out from the small window in the door, "Mr. Zach!" Luke cried, his voice cracking with fear. He fumbled with the lock, and when the door swung open, he launched himself into Zach's arms. Clinging to him tightly, Ben's face peeked out from behind Luke's shoulder, his eyes wide and tear-streaked. Zach held them both, his heart aching with the fear and trust he saw in their faces. "It's okay. You're safe now," he murmured, fighting back the emotions that threatened to overwhelm him. "I'm not going to let anyone hurt you." Downstairs, Rhodes was on her phone, issuing rapid instructions to her contacts in law enforcement. "We need a secure perimeter around Mitchell's property now. Cole's men might try to breach the house, and get a unit to the old Mitchell-Prescott building. They were snooping around there." She hung up as Zach came down the stairs, holding Ben in one arm while Luke clung to his hand. Her expression softened for a moment as she took in sight, but then she turned back to business. "Backup's on the way. But if Cole's men come back before they get here..." Zach set Ben down on the couch, meeting Rhodes's gaze with a grim determination. "Then we do what we have to. I won't let them take these kids." Rhodes nodded, slipping an extra clip into her sidearm. "We make our stand here." Minutes later, a black SUV skidded to a stop outside the front gate, and Zach's heart lurched as he recognized the figure that emerged, Nathan Cole, his face twisted with rage, a gun clenched in his hand. Rhodes took position by the front window, her gun trained on the driveway. "Stay behind me, Zach. We have the advantage in here. Let them make the first move." Zach crouched beside her, keeping a protective arm around Luke, who clung to his side, trembling. Ben whimpered in his brother's arms, sensing the tension in the air. Zach's mind raced, trying to think of a way out of this that didn't end in bloodshed. But Cole's voice rang out across the driveway, cold and mocking. "Mitchell, you think you can hide behind a badge and a gun? You think I won't come in there and take what's mine?" Zach swallowed hard, feeling Luke's small hands tighten around his arm. He took a deep breath and stood, stepping into the doorway so that Cole could see him through the glass. "You don't have to do this, Cole," he shouted, trying to keep his voice steady. "Whatever you're after, it's over. You're not getting those kids." Cole's eyes flashed with fury, and he raised his gun, aiming straight at Zach. "You think I care about those brats? They're leverage, Mitchell, nothing more. Now hand over the box, or I'll burn your whole life down." Rhodes shifted beside him, readying her weapon, but Zach held up a hand. He could feel the weight of the wooden box against his side, the secrets it held, secrets that might finally give them the edge. He knew what he had to do. He reached into his coat and pulled out the box, holding it up for Cole to see. "You want this?" he called out, his voice ringing across the yard. "Then come and get it." Cole's sneer widened, and he took a step forward, his gun trained on Zach. But before he could cross the threshold, a sudden burst of headlights lit up the driveway, and a convoy of police vehicles screeched to a halt behind him. Cole whirled around, his face contorting with rage as Detective Rhodes's backup poured out of their cars, weapons drawn. "Freeze! Drop your weapon!" Cole hesitated for a fraction of a second, then made his decision. He turned back towards the house, his finger tightening on the trigger, but Rhodes fired first. The shot rang out, echoing through the night, and Cole crumpled to the ground, clutching his shoulder. Zach watched as the officers rushed forward, disarming Cole and securing the scene. He let out a shuddering breath, his legs nearly giving out beneath him as the adrenaline faded. Rhodes turned to him, her expression fierce but relieved. "It's over, Zach." "We got him." Zach nodded, glancing back towards the living room where Luke and Ben watched with wide, fearful eyes. He forced a smile, trying to hide the tremble in his hands. It's over. Hours later, the mansion was filled with the soft hum of police radios and the low murmur of voices as officers cataloged evidence and interviewed witnesses. Zach sat on the couch with Luke and Ben, holding them close as they huddled beneath a blanket. Rhodes returned from outside, dusting snow off her shoulders. She crouched in front of Luke, her expression gentle. "You're very brave, Luke," she said softly. "You kept your brother safe, and you helped us stop some very bad people." Luke bit his lip, glancing up at Zach. "Are we really safe now?" Zach wrapped an arm around his shoulders, pulling him close. "You are, buddy, and I'm going to make sure it stays that way." Rhodes rose, giving Zach a nod. "We'll take Cole into custody and get started on the evidence you found. But there's going to be a lot of questions. About Michael Prescott, about the debts. It's going to be a long process." Zach met her gaze, the weight of the past still heavy, but no longer suffocating. "I'll deal with it. Just make sure the kids don't get dragged into it. They deserve a chance to be kids again." She smiled faintly, tucking a strand of hair behind her ear. "You're not such a bad guy, Zach Mitchell. Maybe you've even found yourself a heart somewhere along the way." Zach managed a laugh, though it was tinged with emotion. "Maybe I did, and it's thanks to them." Later that night, after the police had cleared out and the mansion had settled into an uneasy quiet, Zach tucked Luke and Ben into bed, sitting beside them as they drifted off to sleep. He watched the rise and fall of their small chests, feeling the enormity of the moment, the way his life had changed in ways he'd never imagined. As he left the room, he found Rhodes waiting in the hallway, leaning against the wall with a thoughtful expression. "What now?" she asked quietly. Zach let out a long breath, glancing back towards the closed door of the guest room. "Now, I try to give them a real home, and maybe try to build one for myself too." Rhodes's eyes softened, and for a moment, the tension between them melted away, leaving only understanding. "You're a good man, Zach, and you've done more for those boys than anyone else ever would." Zach shook his head, a small smile tugging at his lips. "They've done more for me than they'll ever know." The days following the confrontation passed in a blur of police reports, lawyer consultations, and hushed conversations. The mansion, once filled with the sounds of running feet and laughter, now felt heavy with the weight of everything that had happened. Detective Rhodes had arranged for a temporary security detail to watch over the property while Nathan Cole's associates were rounded up. The arrests made headlines, the story of a corrupt debt collector targeting a businessman's wards quickly becoming a media sensation. Reporters camped outside the front gates, hungry for a statement, but Zach remained inside, focused on the children and the long road ahead. In the quiet hours of the morning, Zach found himself in his study, poring over the documents he and Rhodes had retrieved from the hidden box. The bank records and offshore accounts painted a picture of desperation. Michael Prescott's final attempts to shield his family from the financial ruin he'd found himself in. Zach traced his fingers over an old photograph he'd found in the box. A younger Michael, standing with Luke and Ben on a beach, their faces lit up with joy. A pang of guilt twisted inside him as he thought of the choices that had led them all to this point. Choices that had driven Michael away and left his children to face the consequences. He looked up as Rhodes entered the room, holding 2 steaming cups of coffee. She set one down in front of him, then leaned against the desk, her expression pensive. "You look like you haven't slept in days." Zach let out a humorless chuckle, taking the cup gratefully. "That's because I haven't. There's too much to figure out. The legal stuff alone. There's no clear path for me to keep the boys." Rhodes nodded, her face softening. "We're working on that. Cole's confession helped tie up some loose ends, and the evidence you found is solid. But the courts are going to want answers, and they'll be looking closely at your history." Zach sighed, leaning back in his chair. "I know, and I've got a lot of mistakes to answer for." She reached out, resting a hand on his shoulder. "You've done more than enough to prove yourself, Zach. Those kids are lucky to have you fighting for them. Just try to remember that you're not alone in this." Zach looked up at her, feeling the warmth of her touch, and for the first time in days, He allowed himself to hope that maybe, just maybe, things might turn out all right. A week later, Zach sat in a courtroom, flanked by his lawyer, facing a judge with stern expression and kind eyes. Across the room, Detective Rhodes sat beside a representative from Child Services, while Mrs. Calloway kept Luke and Ben occupied outside in the waiting area. The judge adjusted her glasses, glancing through the thick stack of reports before her. "Mr. Mitchell, the situation before us is unusual, to say the least. You are not the children's biological relative, and yet you have taken considerable steps to ensure their safety and well-being. The evidence of danger from Mr. Cole's organization is clear, but so is your involvement in a complicated and sometimes volatile business history." Zach took a deep breath, his heart pounding in his chest. This was it. The moment that would decide whether he could keep Luke and Ben, or whether they'd be taken away to an uncertain future. "I understand, Your Honor," he said, his voice steady despite the tremor in his hands. "I'm not a perfect man. I've made mistakes. Big ones. But these kids, they've given me a chance to be better, to be the person I should have been all along. I love them, Your Honor, and I'll do whatever it takes to give them the life they deserve." The judge's gaze softened as she studied him. "Detective Rhodes, your report indicates that Mr. Mitchell has been cooperative throughout this investigation and that his actions were instrumental in bringing down a dangerous criminal network. Is that correct?" Rhodes nodded, her expression firm. "Yes, Your Honor. I've seen firsthand the care and commitment Mr. Mitchell has shown to Luke and Ben. He's proven that he's willing to fight for them, even at great personal risk." The judge was silent for a long moment, considering the weight of their words. Then she looked back at Zach, a small smile tugging at the corners of her lips. "I am inclined to believe that Luke and Ben deserve stability, and that they have found that in your care. I will approve temporary guardianship while we continue to assess the best permanent placement, but know that I will be keeping a close eye on this case." Relief flooded through Zach, and he felt a tight knot in his chest loosen. He nodded, his voice thick with emotion. "Thank you, Your Honor. I won't let you down." Later, outside the courthouse, Zach found Luke and Ben waiting with Mrs. Calloway. Luke ran to him, his eyes wide with anticipation. "Did the judge say we could stay?" Zach crouched down, pulling both boys into a tight hug. He could feel his eyes burning with unshed tears. "Kiddo, the judge said you can stay with me for now." Luke's face lit up with a smile that was brighter than the morning sun. "You mean it? We're not going anywhere?" Zach nodded, holding him close. "We're a team, remember?" Ben giggled, squirming in his arms, and Zach lifted him into the air, spinning him around as he laughed. Mrs. Calloway wiped away a tear, her face creased with a smile. Rhodes watched the scene from a few steps away, a small, satisfied smile playing on her lips. When Zach met her gaze, he mouthed a quiet, "Thank you," and she nodded, acknowledging the shared understanding between them. Back at the mansion, life began to settle into a new kind of normal. Zach threw himself into creating a safe, loving environment for Luke and Ben, transforming the once cold halls of his home into a place of warmth and laughter. He cleared out one of the old storage rooms and turned it into a playroom, filling it with books, toys, and a second-hand train set he'd found at a local thrift shop. In the evenings, after dinner, Zach would read to the boys, telling them stories of adventure and bravery. Sometimes Luke would curl up beside him, resting his head on Zach's shoulder, while Ben dozed in his lap. Those moments became Zach's anchor, the quiet reminder that he was building something real and lasting. But the shadows of the past still lingered, and Zach knew that there was more work to be done both for the boys and for himself. One rainy afternoon, Zach found Luke sitting alone by the window, staring out at the rain-slicked driveway. He could see the troubled thoughts playing across the boy's face, the weight that still lingered in his young heart. Zach sat down beside him, resting a hand on his back. "Hey, buddy, what's on your mind?" Luke hesitated, then spoke in a small voice. "Do you think Dad's watching us? Do you think he knows that we're okay?" Zach's heart ached at the question. He glanced out at the stormy sky, wishing he could offer Luke the reassurance he needed. "I think your dad would be really proud of you, Luke. He'd be proud of how brave you've been and how you've taken care of Ben. Luke looked up at him, his eyes wide and searching. Do you think he'd be proud of you too? The question caught Zach off guard, and he felt a lump form in his throat. He thought about Michael, about the man he had been before ambition and greed had driven them apart. He thought about the promises he had broken, the years he had spent avoiding the truth. I hope so, he said quietly, his voice barely more than a whisper. I'm trying to make up for the mistakes I made, Luke, and I promise you, I'm going to keep trying, every day. Luke studied him for a long moment, then reached out and took his hand, his grip small but firm. I think he'd be proud, he said simply. Zach felt a tear slip down his cheek, and he squeezed Luke's hand, unable to find the words for the gratitude he felt. They sat together in the quiet, listening to the rain, finding comfort in the unspoken understanding between them. As the weeks passed, Zach worked with Detective Rhodes to finalize the case against Cole's associates, using the evidence he'd found to shut down the remaining branches of their network. The process was long and grueling, but each step forward brought a little more light into the future he was building for Luke and Ben. He also spent time with child psychologists, seeking advice on how to help the boys process their trauma and loss. He was learning, slowly, how to be the kind of father they needed. One who listened, who cared, who didn't have all the answers but was willing to try. One evening, as they sat around the dinner table, Zach watched as Luke helped Ben with his spaghetti, showing him how to twirl the noodles around his fork. It was a simple, ordinary scene, but it filled Zach's heart with a warmth he hadn't felt in years. He glanced across the table at Rhodes, who had become a regular visitor, and found her watching the scene with a soft smile. When she caught him looking, she raised an eyebrow playfully. "What are you smiling at?" Zach shook his head, a genuine smile spreading across his face, just thinking that maybe for once things are actually going right. She chuckled, but her gaze softened. "You deserve it, Zach." And so do they. 3 months later, the icy grip of winter began to loosen its hold, giving way to the first hints of spring. The snow in the yard around the Mitchell mansion melted into patches of green, and sunlight streamed through the tall windows, casting warm light into the rooms. Inside, the atmosphere had changed as well. Laughter and the sound of Ben's small feet running through the hallways had replaced the silence that once filled the space. The cold, polished surfaces were now covered with Luke's drawings and school projects, and a cozy clutter of toys and books lined the shelves. Zach stood in the living room, helping Luke with a model airplane they were building together. Ben toddled around them, clutching a stuffed bear that was nearly as big as he was. "Careful with the glue there, Luke," Zach instructed gently, holding up the fragile wing of the model. "We don't want to get it on the table." Luke rolled his eyes but smiled, his hand steady as he applied the glue. "I know, Mr. Zach." Zach grinned, watching the boy's serious concentration. He had seen so much change in Luke over the past few months. The fear and uncertainty had been replaced by growing confidence, a lightness that came with knowing he was safe. Ben plopped down beside them, dropping his bear onto Zach's lap. "Up," he demanded, his chubby hands reaching up toward Zach. Zach couldn't help but laugh. He scooped up Ben, setting him on his knee while Luke finished the airplane's final touches. He glanced towards the kitchen, where Mrs. Calloway was busy preparing lunch, humming to herself. For the first time in years, Zach felt a sense of belonging that had nothing to do with boardrooms or financial reports. It was the small, simple moments like this that mattered now, the sense of family that he had never known he needed. That afternoon, Zach received a phone call from his lawyer, a cheerful man named Frank Reynolds, who had become a regular part of their lives during the adoption process. "Zach, I've got some good news for you." Frank's voice crackled through the phone. "The court has approved your petition for permanent guardianship. You're officially the legal guardian of Luke and Ben Prescott." Zach's breath caught in his chest, and he found himself gripping the phone tightly. "It's done? They're really staying with me?" Frank chuckled. "That's right. The judge said she was impressed with the progress you've made, and there's no longer any reason to delay. Congratulations, Zach. You're a dad." Zach thanked him and hung up, his mind reeling. He turned to find Luke watching him from the doorway, his head tilted with curiosity. "What's wrong, Mr. Zach?" Luke asked, frowning as he tried to read Zach's expression. Zach knelt down in front of him, his voice thick with emotion. "Nothing's wrong, buddy. In fact, everything's perfect. The court says that you and Ben can stay with me for good. We're a family now." Luke's eyes went wide, and then he threw his arms around Zach's neck, squeezing him tightly. "Really? We don't have to leave?" Zach held him close, feeling the weight of his promise finally lifted. "Really? We're going to be together just like I promised." Ben, not understanding the significance of the moment but sensing the joy, clapped his hands and babbled happily, adding his own celebration to the mix. That evening, Zach sat on the back porch, watching as the sun dipped below the horizon, casting the sky in shades of gold and rose. He felt a presence beside him and looked up to see Detective Rhodes, no, Samantha, joining him, a quiet smile on her face. "Thought I'd drop by to see how the new dad is handling things," she teased, leaning against the porch railing. "How does it feel, Zach?" Zach smiled, the warmth of her presence easing the last of his tension. "It feels right. Like this is what I was meant to do all along." He glanced back towards the house where Luke and Ben were playing with Mrs. Calloway. "It's not easy, but it's worth it." Every second, Samantha studied him for a moment, her expression thoughtful. "You've come a long way, you know. When we first met, I wasn't sure you were ready for any of this. But now," Zach chuckled, rubbing the back of his neck. "I wasn't so sure myself. But those boys, they gave me a chance to change. I think maybe I needed them as much as they needed me." Samantha stepped closer, her hand brushing against him. "And what about you, Zach? What do you need now?" Zach met her gaze, his heart pounding in his chest. He reached out, taking her hand in his, and for a moment, the world seemed to pause around them. "I think I've found what I need right here, but I'm hoping that maybe you'll be part of that too." Her eyes softened, and she smiled, a real, genuine smile that made Zach's chest tighten. "Zach, I'd like that a lot." As the sun disappeared below the horizon, Zach pulled her into his arms, holding her close as the first stars appeared in the twilight sky. For the first time, he allowed himself to believe that they had a future, one that was built on trust, hope, and the promise of a new beginning. Over the next few weeks, life settled into a gentle rhythm. Zach enrolled Luke in a nearby school, and he and Samantha helped him adjust to the new routine. They attended parent-teacher meetings together, helped with homework, and made a point of celebrating each small victory. Ben, still too young for school, spent his days with Mrs. Calloway, who had become a permanent fixture in their lives. She took to doting on the little boy, teaching him nursery rhymes and baking cookies with him in the afternoons. Zach, meanwhile, continued to rebuild Mitchell Holdings, this time with a new focus on community engagement and ethical business practices, something Michael Prescott had always envisioned. It wasn't easy, but he found satisfaction in the work, knowing that he was building something that Luke and Ben could one day be proud of. On a sunny Saturday afternoon, Zach, Samantha, Luke, and Ben gathered in the backyard for a picnic. The air was filled with the scent of freshly mowed grass and the sound of Luke's laughter as he chased Ben across the lawn. Samantha sat beside Zach on the picnic blanket, leaning her head on his shoulder. "It's hard to believe how much has changed in just a few months," she murmured, watching the boys play. Zach wrapped an arm around her, feeling a peace he had never known before. "But I wouldn't change a thing." She glanced up at him, her eyes shining with a mischievous light. "Even the parts where you nearly got yourself killed?" Zach laughed, pressing a kiss to her temple. "Maybe I'd change a few of those parts, but not the rest." They sat together, watching as Ben toddled over with a bouquet of dandelions, holding them up proudly. "For you, Daddy," he declared, his voice bright with joy. Zach's heart swelled, and he took the dandelions with a smile. "Thank you, Ben. They're perfect." Luke joined them, plopping down on the blanket beside Samantha. He looked up at her with a serious expression, then at Zach. "Does this mean you're part of our family too, Detective?" Samantha's eyes softened, and she exchanged a look with Zach before turning back to Luke. "I hope so, Luke. If that's okay with you." Luke considered this for a moment, then nodded solemnly. "I think we'd like that." Zach wrapped his arms around both boys, feeling Samantha's hand slip into his. In that moment, he knew that the shadows of the past were finally behind them. What lay ahead was a future filled with laughter, love, and the promise of a better life for all of them. 1 year later, the Mitchell household was a hive of activity. The mansion had been transformed into a warm, welcoming home, filled with photos of the family and memories of their new life together. On Luke's first birthday, as an official member of the Mitchell family, they threw a celebration in the backyard, inviting neighbors and new friends. Zach watched as Luke blew out the candles on his cake, surrounded by people who cared about him. His face glowing with happiness. Samantha stood beside Zach, slipping an arm around his waist. "We've come a long way, haven't we?" she said, resting her head on his shoulder. Zach kissed her hair, his heart full. "We have, and we've got a long way to go, but I can't think of a better place to start." As the sun set over their little gathering, casting golden light across the backyard, Zach felt a deep, abiding peace settle over him. He looked at Luke and Ben, at the life they had built together, and knew that he had finally found his true purpose. The man who had once measured success in wealth and power now found it in the love of 2 children, in the quiet joy of family, and in the promise of a better tomorrow. And for the first time, Zach Mitchell knew that he wouldn't have it any other way. As we wrap up this heartfelt journey of redemption, love, and the power of family, we hope this story touches your heart as much as it did ours. If you enjoyed watching Zach, Luke, and Ben find their way to a new beginning, and if you believe in the strength of second chances, don't forget to subscribe to our channel. By subscribing, you'll stay updated with more stories that remind us all of the importance of hope, resilience, and the bonds that hold us together. Hit the notification bell so you never miss a new chapter in the tales we share. Your support helps us continue to create content that inspires and brings a little more warmth into the world. Thank you for being part of this story, and we look forward to sharing many more with you.